Hi, this is Joe Canary. This is the next screencast, which focuses on unit testing and the tests I've given you, in particular testing with assertions. The test that I've given you for language test, if you run them as JUnit tests, will fail initially. This is no surprise because, of course, the implementations I've given you are empty. These are the things that you need to write. At the moment, all closure does and all concatenate does is return null. That is the implementation of these two methods, and therefore they just aren't doing what they are expected to do, and therefore the tests fail. Now you can see the implementations of these methods is a bit more rich than that. It actually says assert false and then return null, and that means please crash. I am not going to do what I promised to do. This implementation is actually incorrect. This is actually a correct implementation, but it just doesn't do anything interesting. It just halts. So in general, what you want to do is, as you program and as you execute tests and as you execute programs, you would like to actually execute these assertions so that you can write them in and say what you expect to be true in your program at a specific place. And if it's not true, the program should stop then and there. To do so, first off, you need your compiler to be interpreting these assert statements in Java appropriately. And if you have your Eclipse set up to be using the Java 5 compiler or Java 6 compiler, then by default that is happening. What is not happening is they are not being asked to execute at runtime. If we check our run configurations, for example, for language test, the language test run configuration just says run a single test, and it is the language test class in JUnit 4. And all the other settings here are the defaults, essentially. Nothing is configured. In general, anytime I set up any sort of test, like the homework 1 test you see here, or the homework 2 test, I always replicate that test to a second test, which I call the same thing with an EA, which means enable assertions. And in this other run configuration, I go into the arguments section and I add to the VM arguments -EA. Now -EA tells the Java virtual machine to execute assertions. So any place that you wrote an assertion, it's going to actually execute that statement. It's going to check that it's true, and if it's not, it's going to halt. So if I apply that and I now run that particular configuration, the tests will still fail, but now they will fail with assertion errors. It will actually show us the line of code in which the assertion failed. Likewise for toString, it has failed, although in its case it's failing for a null pointer exception because we haven't set up some other things. This language empty field right here you've been asked to implement, and it's null at the moment, so we're trying to call the toString method on null, so that's no surprise. Now if I run this exact same set of language tests, but instead now I use coverage, which we saw earlier. If I were to run it normally without the EA and then look at the coverage of language, you'll see that it thinks, sorry, I ran the wrong one, so let me run the correct one. So I'm going to run, let's see, coverage configurations. Let's make sure I'm running the correct one, language tests and homework 2 template. Coverage. So those will fail, and you will see in the coverage of the test itself exactly what executed and what did not execute. So all the setup stuff essentially executed, but the tests themselves failed because the very first test in them failed, and therefore every single method and every single test in here failed. If we look at the cover of the actual language class that's being tested, we see the same sort of thing. Now, because I ran the program using enable assertions, it shows us that the assertion ran correctly. That's why it's in green, and then it never got to the return statement. So in general, it's a good idea to run your programs with assertions enabled and to run them with coverage analysis on occasion. Now just to show what a correct run of tests look like, if I open up the exact same language test class, but now I'm testing against my implementation of language, we can see that in this case, if I run to double check, I'll look language test for homework 2, and let's go ahead and you can see that in the arguments EA is not enabled here, and we run coverage, we'll see that all the tests pass, so everything is green, which is nice. If we look at the language test class itself, we see everything is green in here, which means it ran every single test. And if we look at the output down here in the coverage window, and we analyze the output with regards to the language class itself, we see that that class has 97.3% of its instructions covered by the testing, which is a very, very high percentage. You want to aim for this in your implementation language. You want everything to be green, you want all tests to pass, and you'd like your coverage analysis of the language class to be over 90%. So that's testing using assertions, with and without assertions, and how to set up and run configurations here in the coverage configuration window and in the run configuration window. I will mention in these configuration windows you can customize these a bit more by saying where various configurations are located in menus for quick access. And in general, anytime you push this button without pulling down the menu, it will run the last thing you ran. Likewise, if you have the JUnit window open here and you push this button here, it will rerun the tests that are actually in that window. And that way you don't have to go digging around these menus all the time. So that's unit testing in a nutshell, and in particular testing languages. I hope you have some fun with it.